Shalom, I'm Eddie Chumney of Hebraic Heritage Ministries, and we welcome you to this week's Focus Israel Report. In this week's report, we're going to share with you an examination of the history of the relationship between the Obama administration and Israel. And in doing so, we're going to share with you part 2 of the interview with Israel's former ambassador to the United States, Michael Oren, and it is as follows. He was asked, in what way? He answered, to use an administrative term, there was going to be a full court press on the settlement issue and the settlement and Jerusalem issue, which are going to be partially difficult for the leader of the Likud political party. This is a party with a platform and a constituency on the two-state solution. Now, Netanyahu, a month later, would deliver his Bar Ilan speech, in which he accepted the two-state solution, but at the time he was not yet prepared. He had not yet laid the groundwork, and in a different type of environment, in a different type of rapport, you say to the President of the United States, listen, I'm going to come out with this, but give me a little wiggle room here. Give me a little latitude. Let me lay the groundwork for this. Don't rush it. But I don't think he got that type of latitude. My general disposition as ambassador was to say, let's try to be as flexible as possible, certainly on the peace issue, because eventually we're going to have to dig in our heels on the Iran issue. Occasionally I was successful in persuading people back in Israel that this was the right approach. But every time the Prime Minister made a major concession like the Bar Ilan speech or like the moratorium on the settlements, which went from November 2009 until September 2010, he didn't get much credit for it. And this cost him substantially in terms of support in his own party. What we needed is what's known in diplomacy as tailwind. We needed the President to come out and say very unequivocally, this is a major move. This is a great contribution to the peace process. This took guts on the part of Netanyahu. And we couldn't get those statements from Obama. And ultimately, that type of approach strengthened the hands of those who were against making concessions in the peace process. He was asked. The diplomat, Dennis Ross of the United States, told us in an interview that they were extremely naive about being transformative, and that Cairo, in many ways, is a manifestation of that. The decision not to stop in Israel after the Cairo speech in 2009, you're in the area of the world, and you're not going to stop in Israel? What kind of signals does that send? He answers, not only they didn't stop in Israel, Obama went to Buchenwald, which tended to fortify the case that Israel's justification emerged from the Holocaust. Now, I don't know if this is too much inside ball, but that's the Arab perspective. The Arab narrative is Europeans killed European Jews, and they dumped the survivors in Palestine, and the Arabs have to pay for Europe's crimes against Jews. And why should Arabs have to do that? Now, this narrative is problematic. Why would you make peace with an illegitimate refugee state of Europeans? So even that, in terms of the peace process, was a step backward. What you want to say to the Arab world, in which Obama, to his credit, eventually did in November 2011 in his speech to the United Nations General Assembly, is the following. Israel is not about the Holocaust. Israel is about a 3,000-year-old Jewish claim to the area. He was asked, but at that time he got some bad advice handed to him, or what happened? He answers, I think this was the most centralized American administration certainly since World War II, and I learned early on that the roads of decision-making, virtually without exception, led to the White House. And yes, the President may have gotten advice from his Chief of Staff, Rahm Emanuel, from Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, but at the end of the day, the person who really decided was the President himself. And the President's worldview, and I will keep harping on that, all of these decisions were very much in keeping with his worldview. And he's asked, and what is that worldview? He answers, the notion of linkage is practically doctrinal in the Obama administration. What does linkage mean? That if you solve the Arab-Israeli conflict, you will solve a whole series of other conflicts in the Middle East. So if you believe that the Arab-Israeli conflict is the core conflict in the Middle East, and the core of that conflict is what the administration calls the Israeli occupation and the settlements, then that leads you obviously to the conclusion that you have to force Israel to give up the settlements, to talk about a two-state solution, to stop building in parts of Jerusalem. He was asked, in 2011 the Arab Spring happens, And Obama goes to the U.S. State Department in May and gives a speech that I think breaks what everybody says is the sort of cardinal rule. Doesn't let you know that they're about to mention in the speech the 1967 borders, that this is going to be a part of the speech. He answers, "On the contrary, I was informed that they would not mention it. I was in the White House the day prior to the speech." So he's asked, "Tell us the story." He answers, "The pillars of the U.S.-Israel relationship, two of the pillars had always been no daylight, no surprises." Now that doesn't mean that these pillars weren't at various times dodged. Israel in 1981 attacked the Iraqi nuclear reactor without telling the United States. Israel negotiated with the PLO in September 1993 without telling the United States, rather blatantly. But those examples are few and very far between. For the most part, these two principles held. What is no daylight? No daylight was we can have our differences, and they can be sometimes very deep differences over settlements, over Jerusalem. But to the greatest degree possible, we're going to try to keep them behind the scenes and work them out between us, which was very different than the Obama administration's position from the first day, and that is to take these disagreements and make them public. Obama was quoted in a meeting with American Jewish leaders saying, "I intend to put daylight between Israel and the United States." This was Obama's decision. No surprises meant that if the United States was going to give a major policy statement on the Middle East that would impact Israel and its security, then Israel would have a chance to view that statement in advance and to submit its comments. That was the case in 2002, when then President George Bush presented the roadmap to peace. He gave it to then Israel Prime Minister Ariel Sharon before he went public with it. Israel had no advance warning of the 2009 Obama Cairo speech. Complete shock. By that time, I had been almost 2 years serving as ambassador, and I had grown accustomed to the fact that I was not going to get any advance warning. But on the previous day, on May 18, 2011, I was in the White House and I asked, "Okay, what's in the speech?" There was a lot of excitement about the speech. This was going to be the president's major address speaking about the Arab Spring, which had broken out 5 months earlier in Egypt. I was very curious. There were rumors floating around. I had long anticipated that the administration may say something about the 67 borders, but I received assurance that it wasn't going to be there. And roughly a quarter of the speech on May the 19th was about the 67 borders, and it became the headline. The headline in the New York Times was, "President Obama endorses the 67 borders." The rest of the speech about the Arab Spring went virtually unreported. Now for Israel, this was a major development. I did a lot of press at the time, and it was difficult to explain why this was so earth-shattering. Everyone knew that 67 borders was going to be the basis of the peace agreement. That's what the conventional wisdom was regarding the peace process. In diplomacy, you work out a framework for negotiations. It's called a term of reference. And Israel and Secretary Clinton had worked out laboriously over many weeks, perhaps months of negotiations, the terms of reference. Now I have this terms of reference more or less emblazoned on my soul to this day, and it goes something like this. The United States believes that through good faith negotiations it can reconcile the Israeli goal of an independent Jewish state within secure and defensible borders, and the Palestinian goal of an independent Palestinian state based on the 1967 borders with mutually agreed land swaps. And there sometimes was a little add about taking into account changes on the ground, which was a reference to the settlement blocks. So what in the terms of reference had been a Palestinian goal all of a sudden moved over to an American goal, by the way, for the first time since 1967. Now the 1967 borders were very problematic from Israel's point of view. Our major highway between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem runs through the 1967 borders. The 67 borders includes our holiest site, the Western Wall. It puts the Palestinian state's borders within mortar range of Israel's airport. This is very problematic. So again, it pushed the Palestinians away from the peace table, but also created great problems for the Prime Minister, and it was a breach of trust. That was the true problem here, because peace, if you can achieve it, has got to be based on trust. We're talking about the lives of our kids here. You've got to be able to put your trust in somebody, and particularly in your best ally. So it was quite a tense period. And Netanyahu, as it happens, comes the next day, May the 20th. He was going to make a major address to AIPAC, and he was going to address a joint session of Congress. So he's asked, "What do you think's going to happen?" He answers, "I had never seen him like that coming out of the plane. You know, you come out of the plane, Usually you land at Dulles Airport or at Andrews Air Force Base and you smile for the cameras. There was no smile. There was no wave. You can almost imagine the stream coming out of his ears. We proceeded to Blair House, where his team of advisors tried to calm him down. But he had things he wanted to say to the president. He was asked, "Does he ride in the car with you from the airport?" He answers yes. He's asked, "So what's Netanyahu like in the car ride?" He answers, "He's angry, very angry." And I understood it. Moreover, I was the one who had sent the report the previous day that the White House had said that he wasn't going to be there. So I became the messenger here, and the events transpired very quickly then. We have a good meeting in the White House. There's a one-on-one that characteristically goes on more than twice its scheduled time. The two leaders emerge. They have this talk. Netanyahu gives his about 10-minute speech, which he managed to memorize very quickly. Netanyahu has that capability. And the remarks are addressed to the Palestinians. The Palestinians have to understand that Israel is the Jewish state. They have to understand that Israel has to have a prolonged military presence along the Jordan River to prevent any future Palestinian state from becoming Gaza or South Lebanon. There are a number of things that the Palestinians have to understand. They understand that Palestinian refugees are going to come back to Palestine and not to Israel. Not particularly controversial. And then afterward, the Prime Minister and the President stroll on the South Lawn for about 20 minutes. I'm at a respectable ambassador distance, but they're having a perfectly congenial talk. The President slaps the Prime Minister on the back, shakes his hand, says, "Goodbye, my friend." We go back to the Blair House thinking, okay, we've gotten by this. It was unpleasant, but we've managed to defuse the crisis. No sooner than we're back that the headlines blare for the first time in history. A foreign leader has lectured the President of the United States in the Oval Office. Lectured in precisely the type of showdown at least I had hoped and others had hoped, to their credit, had hoped to avoid. So he's asked, "So you were with a lot of other guys while they're in there for a couple of hours talking to each other, the President and Netanyahu, or for an hour and a half?" He answers, "Yes." And he's asked, "Is White House Chief of Staff Bill Daley and all those guys around?" He answers, "They are." He asks, "And you guys were all cordial but slightly anxious about what is actually happening behind closed doors?" He answered, "We had a serious discussion about the content of the speech, and Secretary Clinton was there and made the case that major efforts had been made to change the tone of the speech, change the content of the speech. I think she mentioned the word Hamas hadn't appeared in the speech, that we should take this with a greater sense of equality." He is asked, "Because you guys had indicated that there was some electric tension in the air." He answers, "I had very open channels with people in the White House. Right after the speech, I called and said, you understand this is going to be problematic, and you understand that this is going to evoke a very strong reaction from Israel." He's asked, and they said, he answers, that it would be a mistake to react angrily to this. He's asked, so there they are, the two guys, and we've all seen the stock footage. Netanyahu's talking, Obama's doing this, and looking like, he answers, he's actually listening very intently. He was focused. I didn't get the sense that he was angry. He's asked, but Chief of Staff Bill Daley was angry. He answers, Bill Daley was very angry. He's asked, he was whispering, who does Netanyahu think he is? He answers, he didn't say this to me. He said it to somebody else on the staff that, is your boss in the habit of coming to people's houses and lecturing them? And I only heard that back at Blair House, by which time it was all over the news anyway. But the whole point of our preparation was to avoid that moment. And you know, diplomacy is supposedly the art of the possible. Sometimes it's the art of the unattainable, the unachievable. And this was that moment. Now it begs the question whether various parties had an interest in making that a crisis moment. Now that I can't know, but I could never rule out the possibility. The same thing was true about Obama's so-called snub of Netanyahu. Well, that's going to conclude this week's report, where we shared with you an examination of the history of the relationship between U.S. President Barack Obama and his administration and the Israeli government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Until we do it again, Shalom in Yeshua the Messiah. Amen.